When I first moved into Maplewood Estates, I thought it was perfect: tree-lined streets, smiling neighbors, and an HOA that promised to protect our community's beauty. That was before I discovered their definition of beauty didn't include wildflowers, bees, or anything taller than 6 inches. It started innocently. After years of sterile lawns and humming mowers, I wanted something different, a garden that buzzed, fluttered, and thrived. So, one spring morning, I began transforming my front yard. Out went the uniform grass. In came milkweed, coneflowers, and black-eyed Susans. I spent weekends kneeling in the dirt, listening to the hum of pollinators that soon began visiting. It wasn't long before butterflies dotted the yard like living jewels, and goldfinches darted among the sunflowers. By June, my little ecosystem was in full bloom, and apparently, in full violation. The letter came on a humid Friday afternoon. A crisp white envelope from the Maplewood Homeowners Association. Marked urgent, notice of violation. Your property is in violation of community standards, it began. Specifically, lawn height exceeds approved measurements, and visible overgrowth creates an unsightly appearance. Please correct within 10 days to avoid further fines. Unsightly. That word burned. My garden was teeming with life, yet the HOA saw it as messy. I called the number listed, hoping to explain. The woman on the other end, polite but firm, said, "Sir, we require lawns to be uniform. Wild vegetation detracts from neighborhood harmony." I asked if she knew that monarch butterflies were endangered. She paused before replying, "That's not within the HOA's purview." The fine arrived a week later, $250. With an additional $25 per day if I failed to comply. My neighbors began whispering. A few avoided eye contact altogether. Others quietly offered sympathy but said, "You know how strict they are." I considered giving in. It would have been easier to mow it all down, reseed the grass, and avoid the fight. But when I watched a mother rabbit lead her babies through the tall asters that evening, I realized this wasn't just a garden. It was a refuge. So I refused to pay. Instead, I started researching local environmental codes, wildlife protection laws, and city ordinances. If the HOA wanted a fight, I'd give them one, not out of stubbornness, but out of principle. I didn't know then that my patch of pollinator paradise was about to make headlines, or that the very city that once enforced the HOA's power would soon declare my front yard something no one could touch. A protected wildlife reserve. The HOA summoned me to a formal hearing 2 weeks later. The notice came with a tone of finality. A last chance to resolve the matter amicably before further enforcement. I showed up at the community clubhouse with a folder of printed research and a camera roll full of photos from my garden. The board members sat behind a long table. 5 of them, identical in posture and expression, as if drawn from the same manual of suburban authority. "Mr. Hartley," said the chairwoman, a sharp-eyed woman named Beverly, "we appreciate your attendance. We're here to address your ongoing violation." "Thank you," I said. "But I think there's been a misunderstanding. My yard isn't overgrown. It's a certified pollinator garden, or will be soon. I've submitted an application through the National Wildlife Federation." Beverly's lips tightened. "That may be, but your property must comply with Maplewood's guidelines. Our standards exist to maintain property values." I placed a photo of monarch caterpillars on milkweed in front of her. "You see these? Monarchs can only lay eggs on milkweed. If everyone mows it down, they disappear. We're in a biodiversity crisis, and I'm just trying to do my part." A man at the end of the table chuckled softly. "Mr. Hartley, this is a neighborhood, not a nature preserve." I took a breath. Why can't it be both? They voted unanimously to uphold the fine. I was to clear the garden within 10 days or face escalating penalties. I left furious but also strangely determined. That night, I posted about my situation on social media, attaching photos of the butterflies, bees, and flowers. I titled it, My HOA hates my wildlife garden. By morning, the post had gone viral. Thousands of shares. Hundreds of comments from people who'd faced similar HOA battles. Environmental groups began reaching out, offering advice and support. A local news station called, asking for an interview. That week, the cameras came. Reporters stood in my front yard, filming the very unsightly landscape the HOA wanted gone. A biologist from the city's environmental department even stopped by, impressed by the diversity of species thriving there. And then came the call that would change everything. The city wanted to visit officially. They said my garden might qualify for a local conservation program, one that could give it a status the HOA couldn't override. For the first time in weeks, I smiled. Maybe the fight wasn't about to end in defeat after all. 2 weeks later, a small team from the city Department of Environmental Conservation arrived, clipboards in hand, wide-brimmed hats shading their faces. I greeted them nervously. "Thanks for coming," I said, gesturing toward the wild sprawl of color that had gotten me into so much trouble. Bees droned lazily in the lavender. A dragonfly zipped past, catching the morning sun like stained glass. Dr. Lisa Ortega, the lead biologist, knelt beside a patch of milkweed. "You weren't exaggerating," she said. "I can see at least 3 native bee species already." "Anne, is that a monarch chrysalis?" I nodded proudly. "They've been here since July." Her team began cataloging species, photographing, counting, noting interactions. I watched them with awe. Where the HOA saw weeds, these experts saw life. Every corner of my yard pulsed with ecological significance. One of the inspectors pointed out native asters that hosted migratory butterflies. Another noted the reappearance of a rare bee species once thought absent from the county. "This is remarkable," Dr. Ortega said. "We've been trying to encourage residents to restore pollinator habitats like this. Most HOAs make it nearly impossible." I explained the fines, the hearings, the threats. She sighed. "Unfortunately, that's common. But we might be able to do something about it." 3 weeks later, the city sent me a formal letter. My property, it stated, was being evaluated for designation as an urban wildlife conservation microreserve, part of a pilot program aimed at restoring native habitats within city limits. When I read that line, I nearly dropped the paper. A microreserve meant legal protection under the city's environmental code. It meant the HOA's authority stopped at the boundary of my yard. Beverly from the HOA called the next day, her voice strained. "Mr. Hartley, we've received notice from the city. Could you clarify?" "Oh, it's all official," I said. "They're even putting up signage soon." Within a month, the city installed a small bronze plaque near the sidewalk. "City of Brookdale, Certified Urban Wildlife Reserve. Protected Habitat." The neighborhood buzzed. Some residents applauded. Others grumbled about bugs and messy yards. The HOA held an emergency meeting to review implications. But it didn't matter. Legally, they couldn't touch me. Ironically, within weeks, my once controversial yard became the most photographed spot in Maplewood. School children visited with notebooks, sketching butterflies. Neighbors began planting wildflowers of their own. Even Beverly softened. But I knew the story wasn't over yet. When local news aired the segment, environmentalists began pushing for broader reform, and my small rebellion was about to spark something far bigger than one garden. What began as a neighborhood dispute became a movement. The news segment about my HOA-defying garden spread across regional stations, then national ones. Within months, other homeowners reached out, asking how they could protect their yards too. The city, realizing the enthusiasm, expanded the micro-reserve program. Soon, over a dozen properties in Brookdale were designated as wildlife habitats. Local schools began integrating pollinator conservation into their science curriculum. I found myself speaking at council meetings, advocating for urban biodiversity. My argument was simple: if every block hosted even one small patch like mine, imagine how many pollinators we could support. Even the Maplewood HOA had to adapt. Under public pressure, they revised their landscaping policy, allowing native gardens if maintained responsibly. Beverly, once my biggest critic, invited me to speak at the next community meeting. When I arrived, she stood at the podium. "Mr. Hartley," she said with a small smile, "I think we owe you some thanks. Maplewood looks a little more colorful these days." I laughed. Nature has a way of winning people over. In the months that followed, my yard changed with the seasons, snow bending the dry stems, spring coaxing new life from beneath. Each cycle brought more species, more wonder. What had once been grounds for punishment had become a sanctuary, not just for wildlife, but for the community itself. Then, one bright April morning, I opened my mailbox to find a thick envelope from the State Department of Ecology. Inside was a certificate naming my property an official state-recognized urban conservation site. I couldn't help but smile at the irony. The same plot that earned me a fine was now recognized by the state as an ecological treasure. When the sign was installed, I stood beside it, hands in pockets, watching bees drift among the flowers. A reporter asked, "How does it feel, knowing your garden started all this?" I thought about the letter, the fines, the sleepless nights of frustration. Then I looked at the butterflies dancing in the sunlight and said, "It feels like nature got the last word." And maybe that's how it should be. Because sometimes, what looks like chaos is simply the earth remembering how to heal. If we only have the courage to let it.